How a girl's rejection for marriage turned a young man into a billionaire. No one could have foreseen the path Aiden would take. A young man burdened by poverty and heartbreak, his journey began in the shadows of rejection. Yet, as fate tangled him in secrets and danger, the decisions he made would alter everything, leading to a truth more astonishing than anyone imagined. No one could have predicted what happened. In the quiet hallways of the university, Aiden was known as a bright yet reserved student. He spent hours poring over literature, earning a reputation for his sharp analysis and thoughtful essays. His peers admired his talent, even if he rarely sought the limelight. But beneath this calm exterior, Aiden carried a heavy burden. His family struggled to make ends meet. His parents, hard-working but poor, had poured their limited resources into his education. For them, Aiden was a beacon of hope. Yet, as the final year approached, the pressures mounted. Job offers were scarce, and the looming specter of unemployment cast a long shadow over his days. As the semester neared its end, Aiden found himself drawn to Nora, a spirited student who shared his love for words. Their conversations in the library, filled with laughter and literary debates, became the highlight of his routine. He dared to dream of a future with her, envisioning a life where their shared passions would pave the way to happiness. But the storm was already brewing. Aiden's hopes of securing a position after graduation faltered. Every rejection letter chipped away at his confidence. When he finally confessed his feelings to Nora, her response cut deep. She couldn't envision a life with someone who had no stable future. Her words weren't cruel, but they carried the weight of reality. Aiden watched as his plans unraveled. The dreams he had cherished, the sacrifices his parents had made, and the bond he had hoped to form with Nora, all seemed to slip away. The world he knew began to crumble, leaving him adrift in uncertainty. And as graduation day loomed closer, Aiden realized that his path was about to take an unexpected turn. No one could have predicted what would happen after that heartbreaking moment. Nora's rejection lingered like a shadow over Aiden's thoughts, her words replaying in his mind. He had dared to hope, to believe that their connection could grow into something more. But her refusal was clear. Without a steady income or a solid future, she couldn't commit to him. Aiden retreated into himself. Days passed in a blur, each one heavier than the last. His parents, though supportive, couldn't hide their own disappointment. They had always believed their son's education would lead to a better life for the whole family. Now, with job prospects slipping through his fingers and his heart in tatters, Aiden felt the weight of their unspoken fears. Determined to find a way forward, he began scouring every resource he could find. He sent out countless resumes, applied for internships, and attended networking events. Still, the rejections piled up. Each closed door seemed to echo Nora's words, reinforcing the painful truth. Without financial security, he couldn't build the life he dreamed of. One night, after yet another fruitless search, Aiden sat by the small window in his cramped apartment and stared at the city lights. The glittering skyline seemed so far out of reach, a symbol of the success that always felt just beyond his grasp. But he didn't give up. He couldn't. His family's sacrifices were too great, and his own resolve ran too deep. Somewhere inside, he held on to a faint glimmer of hope. When a friend mentioned a potential opportunity in New York City, a place of endless possibilities, Aiden made a decision. He would leave behind the familiar streets of his hometown and venture into the unknown. The city was a chance to start fresh, to prove himself, and to find the stability he needed to win back the future he had lost. With his heart still aching from Nora's rejection, Aiden packed his bags and set out on a journey that would change his life forever. Aiden arrived in New York with little more than determination and a few dollars in his pocket. The city, vast and intimidating, buzzed with a frenetic energy that both thrilled and unnerved him. Everywhere he looked, people rushed toward their goals, each step purposeful. Aiden, however, had no clear direction. He wandered the streets for days, searching for anything: work, inspiration, or simply a place to belong. Finding a job proved harder than he expected. Each rejection felt like a reminder of how far he still had to go. Nights were spent in cheap hostels, or, on occasion, under the shelter of bus stations. Hunger gnawed at him, and despair threatened to take root. Yet, somehow, he refused to give up. Aiden clung to the belief that this city, with all its challenges, still held the key to his future. One day, after yet another fruitless job hunt, he overheard two men talking about a wealthy businessman named Robert who was hiring security personnel. Desperation drove Aiden to find Robert's office. The interview was brief. Robert didn't ask for qualifications, only a willingness to work hard. For Aiden, it was a lifeline. A guard position wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to keep him afloat. Working for Robert opened a new chapter. Aiden quickly noticed that Robert was no ordinary employer. The man was shrewd, commanding, and undeniably magnetic. His wealth was obvious, but his business dealings were mysterious. Aiden kept his head down, doing his job without prying too deeply. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Robert's empire than met the eye. As weeks turned into months, Aiden started to rebuild his life. He found a small apartment, began eating regularly, and even sent a little money home to his parents. But the shadow of Robert's influence loomed large. Something about his employer's operations felt off, though Aiden couldn't yet place what it was. He focused instead on doing his job, grateful for the chance to stand on his own 2 feet. However, the deeper he delved into Robert's world, the more he sensed that his life was on the verge of another upheaval. The cold embrace of the city was only the beginning. Aiden had settled into a routine as Robert's trusted guard. The job offered stability, but questions gnawed at him. Robert's wealth came from a vast network of businesses, some legitimate, others shrouded in secrecy. Aiden kept his head down, but he couldn't ignore the whispers or the strange visitors who came and went at odd hours. He noticed documents passed in hushed tones, locked doors, and transactions that never made it onto any official ledger. One evening, after a long day, Aiden returned to his small apartment and began writing in his diary, a habit he had kept since his university days. As he scribbled down his thoughts, he reflected on how far he'd come, yet how precarious his position felt. The diary was his confidant, the one place where he could admit his doubts, his longing for stability, and his unresolved feelings about Nora. The pages held his truth, raw and unfiltered. The next morning, a routine security detail took him to Robert's sprawling estate. Distracted and exhausted, Aiden accidentally left his diary in one of the guest rooms he had checked. By the time he realized it, hours had passed, and the diary was no longer where he had left it. That evening, Robert summoned him. Aiden's stomach churned as he entered the study. The diary lay open on Robert's desk. His employer's expression was unreadable. Aiden braced himself, expecting anger or dismissal. Instead, Robert spoke softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of empathy. "You've been through more than most men twice your age," he said, closing the diary. "I respect that." Aiden was stunned. He had expected criticism or suspicion, not a rare glimpse of humanity from the enigmatic tycoon. Robert handed him the diary and dismissed him with a nod. Aiden left the room confused, but cautiously relieved. However, the incident marked a turning point. Robert began to treat Aiden differently, drawing him closer into his inner circle. What Aiden didn't yet know was that this newfound trust would lead to revelations that would change everything. In the days that followed, Robert's demeanor toward Aiden shifted. The once distant employer now seemed almost fatherly, offering advice and inviting Aiden to dinners with his inner circle. It was as though the diary had opened a door that Aiden never meant to unlock. He tried to maintain his usual guard routine, but Robert's insistence on including him in high-level discussions made that impossible. Aiden didn't know if this was a sign of trust or something more calculated. At first, these meetings seemed benign. They discussed business expansion, new properties, and investments. But soon the topics took on a murkier tone. Aiden started hearing names he didn't recognize, figures who operated outside the traditional business world. There were deals discussed in code, shipments that required no invoices, and payments routed through layers of anonymous accounts. Aiden felt his stomach tighten with every word, but he kept his face neutral. He needed this job, and any questions could risk everything. Then came the night of the attack. A rival group, whose name was only whispered in the underworld, ambushed Robert and his entourage as they returned from a private event. Chaos erupted. Aiden, armed only with a handgun and a moment's courage, stepped in to shield Robert. Gunfire rang out. In the melee, Aiden took a bullet to the arm, but his quick thinking saved Robert's life. When the dust settled, several of the attackers lay injured or captured. Aiden's intervention had prevented a massacre. Back at the estate, Robert was visibly shaken but immensely grateful. He personally tended to Aiden's wound, his stern facade softening. "You've proven your loyalty," Robert said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You're more than just an employee now. You're family." Aiden nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. The line between protector and accomplice was growing blurrier by the day, and he was no closer to understanding what lay at the heart of Robert's empire. Aiden's thoughts raced as he lay in his small apartment that night, his arm bandaged and throbbing. He knew he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Whatever Robert was involved in, it was dangerous, and Aiden was now caught in the middle. The attack changed everything. While Aiden tried to return to his normal duties, the air around Robert's operations grew tense. Security was increased, meetings were held in more secluded locations, and new faces appeared. Grim men who said little and carried themselves like soldiers. Aiden watched it all with a mix of unease and resignation. He had saved Robert's life, but now he was more entangled than ever. One night, Robert called Aiden into his private study. The room, dimly lit by a single desk lamp, felt oppressive. Robert gestured for Aiden to sit. "I owe you my life," he said, his voice steady. "That's not something I take lightly." Aiden nodded, unsure where this was going. "I need you to take on more responsibility," Robert continued. "You've proven your loyalty, and I need someone I can trust, someone who can handle delicate situations." Aiden's pulse quickened. He had a sense of what delicate meant in Robert's world. For a moment he considered refusing, but Robert leaned forward, his expression softening. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, but I'll make sure you're well taken care of, you and your family." The offer was tempting. Aiden's parents could finally live comfortably. He could send them money regularly, maybe even move them to a better neighborhood. But the cost of accepting was steep. He knew that stepping further into Robert's circle meant aligning himself with whatever questionable dealings Robert was involved in. After a long pause, Aiden met Robert's gaze. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Robert smiled faintly. "Just keep an eye on things. Make sure everyone stays in line, and if something feels off, let me know immediately." It sounded simple, almost harmless, but Aiden knew better. The weight of the bargain settled over him as he left the study. He had crossed another line, one that would be nearly impossible to step back from. As Aiden took on more responsibility, he found himself drawn deeper into Robert's world. His new duties required more than just vigilance. They demanded discretion, quick thinking, and a willingness to look the other way. The deals he facilitated were often veiled in secrecy, and the people he interacted with carried an air of quiet menace. Aiden walked a razor's edge, constantly weighing the security of his position against the growing unease in his chest. At first, he convinced himself it wasn't so bad. He told himself that his role was purely administrative, that he wasn't directly involved in anything illegal. But the signs were impossible to ignore. Deliveries arrived late at night, and shipments were labeled with cryptic codes. Meetings took place in shadowy back rooms where cash changed hands without a single receipt. Aiden asked no questions, but the answers were written in every whispered conversation and every locked briefcase. One evening, After weeks of growing tension, Aiden was asked to oversee a particularly sensitive transaction. As he watched the exchange, something about it felt different, more rushed, more desperate. He tried to stay calm, but the weight of what was happening pressed down on him. Later that night, when he returned to his apartment, he stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to reconcile the man he had become with the hopeful student who once believed in honesty and hard work. The stakes were higher now, and so were the risks. Aiden's sense of loyalty to Robert was undeniable, but so was the gnawing realization that the path he was on could lead to his undoing. He had climbed out of poverty and earned a place of respect, yet it had come at the cost of his integrity. The farther he went, the more difficult it became to remember who he truly was. And as the shadows closed in, Aiden began to wonder if he could ever find a way out. As the months wore on, Aiden's unease grew. The once faint suspicions were now undeniable truths. Robert's empire, as vast and dazzling as it appeared, was built on a foundation of crime. The weight of this knowledge pressed on Aiden's conscience, but he felt trapped. He owed Robert his life. He owed him his family's security. And yet, each time he looked at the stacks of untraceable cash, at the coded documents he was tasked with handling, Aiden felt the chasm between who he was and who he had become widening. Then came the night when it all collapsed. A sudden raid. Police stormed Robert's headquarters, and before Aiden could react, he was cuffed and hauled into the back of a patrol car. The days that followed were a blur of questioning and accusations. Detectives pressed him for information, offering leniency if he would testify against Robert. They promised protection, a clean slate. Aiden said nothing. In the holding cell, he thought about Nora, his parents, and the life he had imagined. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had tried to climb out of hardship, to find success and stability. Instead, he was locked up, labeled a criminal. His mind reeled as he considered the choices that had brought him here. Could he have done things differently? Would it have mattered? As the days turned to weeks, the trial loomed. Aiden's silence only deepened the authorities' resolve. They turned up the pressure, using every tactic they could to make him talk. But Aiden remained steadfast. He wouldn't betray Robert. He couldn't. It wasn't loyalty alone that kept him quiet. It was the knowledge that his own hands weren't clean. Speaking out might free him, but it would also lay bare the depths of his involvement. When the trial finally began, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Robert, once untouchable, now faced a grim reality. The evidence was damning. Aiden watched from his seat, his future as uncertain as his employer's. But deep down, he knew that whatever happened next, he would never be the same. Robert sat motionless as the jury delivered their decision. The words, "guilty on all counts," echoed in the courtroom. Aiden felt a hollow ache in his chest. The man who had saved him from ruin, who had shown him kindness amidst his cold empire, was now facing the harshest punishment the law could offer. For a moment, Aiden almost forgot the weight of Robert's crimes. He saw only the man who had given him a chance when no one else would. The sentencing came swiftly. Robert was to face the ultimate penalty. Aiden was left in stunned silence. He had expected prison time, perhaps life without parole. But this was final. There would be no redemption for Robert, no second chance. The man who had once seemed invincible was now just another convict, awaiting his end. Aiden's own trial took a different turn. His silence had frustrated the prosecutors, but his lack of a criminal record and the relatively minor role he played in the overall scheme worked in his favor. In the end, the judge gave him a reduced sentence. After months of anguish, Aiden was set to be released, though the terms of his probation would keep him under watch for years to come. In the days leading up to Robert's execution, Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed him somehow. Not by withholding information, but by not doing more when he had the chance. He thought back to that night in the study, when Robert read his diary and showed an unexpected softness, Perhaps, in another life, he might have persuaded Robert to leave the darkness behind. But that opportunity was gone now. The news came quietly. Robert's final act had been to rewrite his will. When Aiden was released, he learned that everything, Robert's fortune, his properties, his entire estate, had been left in his name. It was a gesture that carried both the weight of gratitude and the burden of guilt. Aiden walked out of prison not as the man he once was, but as someone who would have to figure out what to do with the legacy he never wanted. Aiden's first moments of freedom felt surreal. The air was crisp, the world outside bustling, yet he felt oddly detached. His family was there to greet him, their joy palpable. But Aiden couldn't shake the knowledge of how his release had been paid for, not by his silence, but by a man who had been a mix of mentor and tormentor. Robert's empire was now his to command, yet the fortune felt like a shackle. He returned to the sprawling estate he had once guarded, now quiet and subdued. Robert's former employees awaited his instructions, but Aiden was no longer interested in carrying on the old ways. He called meetings, asked questions, and began dismantling the shadowy structures that had defined Robert's empire. The illegal operations were shut down. The hidden networks were exposed and abandoned. In their place, Aiden laid the groundwork for a legitimate business, one that focused on helping the very communities he and his family had once been part of. It wasn't easy. There were challenges at every turn. Former associates who resisted the changes, rivals who sought to exploit the transition, and the ever-present scrutiny of law enforcement. Yet Aiden faced it all with a quiet determination. He turned to his parents for guidance, leaned on their wisdom, and drew strength from their pride in the man he was becoming. In time, Aiden's transformation began to attract attention. Investors who had once avoided Robert's enterprise now saw a leader trying to do good. Partnerships formed, and the business grew, not through intimidation, but through integrity. The wealth, once a source of shame, became a tool for change. Aiden funded schools, supported local artists, and created scholarships for young writers. His own story served as a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope. As the years passed, Aiden found balance. He met Mila, a kind-hearted woman with a sharp mind who stood by him as he rebuilt his life. Their marriage was quiet, their happiness genuine. With Mila by his side and his family finally secure, Aiden learned that redemption wasn't just about erasing the past. It was about forging a new path, one step at a time.